The funeral in the rain. The relentless autumn rain painted the world in muted shades of gray, draping everything in a veil of cold mist. Wet leaves clung desperately to the pavement outside the small, Gothic-style funeral home, their colors dulled, echoing the somber mood. Inside, the air was heavy with the mingled scents of lilies and earth, as if nature itself mourned with those gathered to say their final goodbyes. Emma stood near the front, her black dress clinging uncomfortably to her skin, hair damp from the walk inside. The rows of mourners blurred before her tired eyes as she stared at her mother's closed casket framed by arrangements of white roses. Occasionally, the hush in the room was broken by muffled sobs or the soft rustle of tissues. Aunts, uncles, cousins from nearby states had gathered, their faces drawn with grief. But Emma couldn't shake the strange numbness coursing through her. Through the haze of condolences and whispered prayers, Emma's gaze kept drifting to Richard, her stepfather. He stood at the back, apart from the family, his hands clasped behind him, posture rigid. People occasionally offered him sympathetic glances, but he returned them with little more than a curt nod. There was no trace of tears in his eyes. Instead, his face wore an unreadable mask. Emma watched as he stole glances at his watch, impatient, as if waiting for something to finally end. A memory flickered in Emma's mind. The late-night phone call, Richard's clipped tone informing her of the accident. The official report said it was a slip by the staircase, a tragic misstep on a rainy evening. But as she approached the casket, Emma couldn't shake the chill crawling up her spine. Her mother had always been cautious, even paranoid about safety. Would she really have left the hallway light off? Would she not have called for help while Richard was in the house? Emma's younger brother, Daniel, leaned into her, tears streaking down his face, seeking comfort. Aunt Susan squeezed Emma's shoulder, murmuring, "Your mother was so proud of you." Emma nodded, barely hearing. A fleeting sense of disconnection gripped her. She felt like a stranger, not just to the moment, but to her own family. After the eulogy, the gathering moved outside for the burial. Cold rain soaked the mourners as umbrellas bloomed like dark flowers across the cemetery. Emma stayed back while others advanced to the grave, observing Richard's every move. He lingered behind, tapping at his phone, his jaw set. Emma noticed how his words to the undertaker were rushed, almost brusque. How he avoided the comforting arms of family and instead lit a cigarette, eyes fixed somewhere in the distance. The service wound down, and people filed away, leaving Emma standing under the battered sycamore tree. She glanced at Richard one final time. He caught her look, but held her gaze for only a second, his expression hardening. That night, back at the house, her mother's house, the silence was suffocating. The rain drummed a steady rhythm on the windows. Emma found herself drawn to her mother's bedroom, now stripped bare of warmth. A faint perfume lingered in the air, hauntingly familiar. She pressed her palm to the edge of the dresser and whispered, "What really happened, Mom?" As distant thunder rolled over the rooftops, Emma's unease grew sharper. The details didn't fit. The stories sounded rehearsed, and Richard's indifference gnawed at her thoughts. She tucked herself into bed with fresh tears on her cheeks and a silent vow swirling relentlessly in her mind. "I will find the truth, no matter what it takes." Murky evidence. Sleep eluded Emma that night. She tossed restlessly, haunted by the hollow ache of her mother's absence and the harsh, unyielding patter of rain against her window. By morning, sunlight struggled through low-hanging clouds, casting pallid, shifting shadows across the quiet house. Her stepfather, Richard, had left early, barely acknowledging Emma and Daniel at breakfast. The kitchen, once the sight of laughter and Sunday pancakes, now vibrated with an unspoken tension. Emma stared at her untouched coffee, mind churning with questions. She couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that the narrative of the accident was too tidy, too convenient. With the house nearly empty, Emma began her own search. She started in the entryway, where her mother allegedly slipped. The police report, which she'd read and reread, stated there was water on the tiled floor, likely tracked in from the rain. Yet the mat inside the door was completely dry and clean. The only shoes by the entrance were Richard's, boots without a trace of fresh mud. Emma moved to her mother's home office, where bills and correspondence lay in neat stacks. She opened desk drawers and sifted through folders, careful not to disturb the order. When she checked her mother's planner, Emma noticed the last entry. A meeting scheduled the evening she died was circled several times, underlined with unusual determination. There was also a receipt from a local hardware store for a replacement light bulb, time-stamped just hours before the accident. Yet the hallway was still dark that night, and the old bulb was nowhere to be found. Driven by a mix of grief and suspicion, Emma powered up her mother's laptop. A password hint, Daniel's birthday, granted her access. Emma searched recent emails, finding a chain of frustrated messages between her mother and Richard involving finances. There were bank alerts about withdrawals Emma's mother hadn't mentioned, and a mysterious recent transfer marked loan repayment that seemed out of character. Then, Emma checked her mother's phone records. At first glance, there was nothing unusual, but a single outgoing call at 9:22 p.m., less than 15 minutes before the fall, caught her attention. It had been made to a number Emma didn't recognize, and lasted only 11 seconds. She saved the number for later investigation. In the hallway, Emma found the security camera her mother had insisted on after a recent rash of neighborhood break-ins. The device light was off. Curious, Emma plugged it into her laptop. Frustratingly, the footage for the day of the accident was missing, the timeline abruptly jumping from noon to midnight. Emma's heart thudded. Had someone tampered with it? Who else but Richard would think to erase the tapes? And how did he even know how? Later that afternoon, her brother Daniel cornered her in the den. "Why are you poking around?" he demanded, his voice edged with fear and fatigue. "You're making everyone nervous. Let Mom rest, Emma. Let it go." Emma tried to explain, but Daniel refused to listen, confusion and hurt written across his face. A tense phone call with Aunt Susan that evening brought further isolation. "It's your grief talking, Emma. We all miss her, but you need to accept what happened. Don't make trouble for the family." The message was clear. Stop digging for answers that nobody else wanted. But Emma's resolve only strengthened. Late that night, sitting in the half-lit kitchen, she laid out her findings like puzzle pieces on a table. Discrepancies in the reports, missing security camera footage, odd financial movement, and cryptic phone calls. Fear gnawed at her, but so did a stubborn hope. If she was right, if Richard was hiding something, she owed it to her mother to expose the truth. For the first time since the funeral, Emma felt a flicker of determination pushing away her numbness. In the silence, she whispered her mother's name, seeking courage from memories of gentle guidance. She would not rest, not until the shadows lifted. Isolation and defiance. If the days before the funeral had been shrouded in numbness, the days that followed pressed in on Emma with the suffocating weight of silence and suspicion. It was as though invisible walls had risen inside the house, hemming her in, crowding her heart and mind with a choking sense of loneliness. The usual comfort she found in routine, getting Daniel ready for school, brewing coffee before work, had evaporated, replaced by awkward silences at breakfast and days spent drifting through half-empty rooms that seemed both too small and too cavernous all at once. Her efforts to investigate her mother's death had not gone unnoticed. She felt it in the cautious glances cast her way during family dinners, and in the way conversations would hush the moment she walked into a room. Daniel grew sullen and withdrawn, refusing to look at her for more than a few seconds at a time. When she tried to bring up the inconsistencies she'd found, the missing camera footage, the strange financial records, Daniel's jaw would clench and he'd mutter, "It's over, Emma. Stop it. You're just making things worse." It wasn't only Daniel. Aunt Susan, usually so warm, rang her up one afternoon, her voice brittle and unyielding. "Sweetheart, I know you're hurting," Susan said, "but you can't let your imagination run wild. Your mother was loved. She's gone now. We need to move forward, not tear the family apart with suspicion. Richard has been through so much." Emma pressed her lips together, forcing back tears of frustration. No one wanted to listen. No one wanted to see. The house pulsed with an undercurrent of denial, subtle yet unbreakable. Every time she tried to discuss her doubts, she was met with gentle but firm reproach. "That's just the grief talking. You're tired. Maybe you should get away for a while. Maybe you need to see someone about all this." But Emma did not want to see anyone. She didn't want to run from the shadows that now haunted her home. She wanted answers. The isolation was deadening at first. Days blurred into nights as she found herself second-guessing every instinct. Was she wrong? Was she really imagining it all? The mere possibility of being mistaken filled her with guilt and self-doubt. She grew pale, distracted. Food tasted like nothing. Even her best friend, Olivia, seemed distant when Emma hinted at not believing the accident was just that, an accident. But when she finally blurted out everything to Olivia one rainy afternoon in a crowded coffee shop, something shifted. Olivia listened more closely than anyone before her, concern darkening her eyes as Emma detailed every suspicion, every stray clue, every strange reaction from Richard and the family. "If I'm wrong, maybe I am losing it," Emma whispered. "But everything inside me says I can't let this go." Olivia reached across the small table, squeezing Emma's icy hand. "Then don't," she said quietly. "Trust your gut, Em. I'll help you however I can, even if that just means listening." It was a thread, thin, but strong enough to hold on to when everything else threatened to unravel. Reinvigorated by the rare spark of support, Emma embraced secrecy. She began to move more cautiously, keeping notes in code, logging on to her mother's accounts in the dead of night, searching for further proof. Each message was encrypted, each paper trail concealed. When she spoke to Daniel or Aunt Susan, she kept her tone light, masking her determination under a facade of weariness. Every small victory, a deleted email recovered, a call history unearthed, another hidden anomaly detected, was swiftly shadowed by the relentless coldness in her own home. Nights became longer, heavier. The house, stripped of her mother's warmth, seemed to whisper doubts with every creak. Yet beneath her exhaustion, the iron of defiance hardened in her chest. She would not let herself be gaslit into silence. She would not let her mother's memory fade into a washed-out tragedy no one wanted to question. The price of suspicion was loneliness, but for Emma, the alternative, complacency, was unthinkable. Now, truly, alone, but no longer paralyzed, she made herself a quiet vow. No matter how much they doubted her, no matter how many doors closed, she would keep searching. And one day, the truth, no matter how dark, no matter how terrible, would come into the light. The truth begins to surface. Days melted into one another as a thin frost of distrust covered everything in Emma's world. The memory of her mother's funeral, the closed casket under dripping sycamores, haunted her, fueling her resolve. In the quiet isolation, Emma became sharper, her suspicions carving out a space for vigilance that had replaced grief. She moved through her days on high alert, watching, listening, quietly waiting for Richard to reveal more than he intended. She had graduated from being a lost daughter to a silent witness, and now, an investigator moving under the familial radar. Richard's patterns, once invisible amid the routines of family life, became glaring to her with each passing day. He began leaving the house at odd hours, inventing vague explanations, picking up paperwork from the office, meeting an old friend, working late. Each time she asked, his tone grew more clipped, more impatient, as if her questions themselves were a personal affront. She noticed, too, the increasing secrecy with which he handled his phone, guarding it as if it were a second wallet. Determined, Emma quietly installed a cheerful facade and kept her real plans to herself. Her evenings were spent gathering what information she could, scouring online banking portals, poring over credit card statements, and cross-referencing times and locations. She soon spotted a pattern of odd withdrawals and unfamiliar purchases, hotels and jewelry stores that made little sense for a grieving stepfather. But it was the recurring cash deposits into an account labeled personal savings that intrigued her most. One rainy Thursday, under the pretense of needing a bottle of cough syrup from his car, Emma slipped on her coat and ventured out. Richard's keys often lived on a hook by the doorway. She grabbed his spare without a sound. She found his car neat, almost sterile, but a quick scan of the glove box revealed more than she'd expected. A receipt, just a week old, from an upscale downtown restaurant, and an unfamiliar bar napkin with a first name and phone number written in looping, feminine script. Back inside, Emma entered the bathroom, locked the door, and snapped a picture of both items on her phone, her heart pounding. She told herself to move carefully. Rushing could tip her hand, not just to Richard, but to anyone still in denial about him. Pressing on, Emma discreetly looked up the number. The result confirmed her suspicions. It belonged to a woman named Allison Walker. On a hunch, Emma searched Richard's social media contacts and found Allison. Her profile picture, an elegant redhead posing at the same restaurant, printed on the receipt. Further digging revealed comments and messages exchanged between Allison and Richard, sometimes veiled in work-related language, sometimes not. Emma's blood chilled as she realized the infidelity had likely begun long before her mother's death. Emma needed proof of more than infidelity, though. One evening, while the rest of the house slept, she broke into Richard's office. His personal laptop was locked, but he'd left a cheap burner phone in the back of a drawer, one she'd never seen. She hesitated only a moment before scrolling through messages and call logs. She found a string of calls leading up to the night of her mother's death, all to an unregistered number and all under the contact initial J. Digging further, Emma transferred the phone's data to her computer. Most of it was innocuous, but one voice memo, dated the night of the accident, caught her attention. With trembling hands, she hit play. Richard's voice filled the room, thick with panic. "I've taken care of it. Should look like a fall. You know what to do. Clean up, stick to the plan. I can't lose this. Not now." The words sent a cold flood through Emma's veins. For a few long moments, she sat frozen, struggling to process the magnitude of what she'd uncovered. The theory that had terrified her for weeks was now a certainty. Her stepfather was not just cheating. He was involved in her mother's death. As daylight crept into the house, Emma's instincts screamed at her to run. But she forced herself to adopt her mother's calm. She would need more than just circumstantial evidence to convince the authorities, or even the family, who already thought she was delusional. Richard, meanwhile, was not as oblivious as he seemed. She caught him glancing at her when he thought she wasn't looking, conversations growing careful at family dinners. Daniel confided in her, voice strained, that Richard had asked what she was so worked up about lately. "He says you're not handling things well, Em. He's thinking maybe you should get away for a while. Rest." Alarm bells sounded in Emma's mind. She doubled her efforts, no longer satisfied with just digital breadcrumbs. She decided to shadow Richard after dinner, trailing him in her own car at a discreet distance. The first few nights led nowhere except to an all-night convenience store and the gym. But on Friday, she followed him downtown, where he parked on a side street and met Allison Walker in the dim light of a cocktail bar. They huddled close, speaking in low tones before briefly embracing in parting ways. Emma snapped photos from across the street, her hands steady despite her racing pulse. On her way home, she thought of her mother's laughter echoing through the kitchen, the feel of her hand brushing Emma's tears away as a child, the safety she once felt in her steadiness. Now, all Emma felt was the weight of responsibility. Back at home, Richard seemed tenser, eyes flicking to her every time she entered a room. The air between them crackled with the unspoken, their interactions now choreographed dances of suspicion. "You've been quiet lately," he commented one night, his smile strained. "Everything all right?" Emma forced herself to meet his gaze, matching his tone for tone. "Everything's fine," she lied. "Why wouldn't it be?" The next day, she noticed Richard spending more time on the phone in the backyard, pacing as he talked in low, urgent tones. Daniel, noticing nothing, remained immersed in video games and grief. Emma realized just how very alone she was, and how dangerous it might become as Richard's vigilance increased. But Emma had reached a point of no return. She organized her findings in folders, encrypted her files, and stored them on cloud drives beyond Richard's reach. Every detail, the cash withdrawals, phone records, hidden relationships, became one more weapon in her growing arsenal. At night, she barely rested, haunted by the possibility that any misstep could give herself away. The realization that Richard suspected her gave her a twisted kind of energy. It was now a battle of wits. For every piece of evidence she uncovered, she tightened her mask, presenting the same careful stillness she'd seen in her mother's deepest grief. If she wanted justice, she would have to see this through, no matter the risk. By the end of that week, Emma had enough for a timeline of Richard's movements, his calls, his relationship with Allison, his connections to the mysterious Jay. But one thing remained out of reach, a direct link tying Richard to the act itself. Something beyond reasonable suspicion, something the world could not ignore or explain away. And that, Emma knew, would require her boldest move yet. As she sat in the darkness of her bedroom, the house silent around her, Emma didn't feel afraid. She felt the cold resolution that had strangled her grief until it crystallized into something dangerously strong. The vow that the truth, no matter how ugly, would see the light. Battle of wits. Emma's world had condensed into a game of shadow and subtlety. Each morning, she wore a mask molded by necessity. Smiling just enough, speaking just enough, keeping her hands from trembling even when her mind raced with fear and calculation. She understood, with a clarity that terrified her, that Richard was watching. No longer simply ignoring her presence, he had shifted from polite indifference to a predator's wariness, his every glance appraising, his silence loaded with possibility. She needed to keep her nerves steady. The evidence she'd uncovered was damning, but Emma knew it was not enough to break through the wall of denial erected by her family and the authorities, the same wall Richard relied on to shield himself from real consequences. She needed something irrefutable. To get it, she would have to pull Richard out of his cold composure, prod him into a mistake. And as she weighed risk against desperation in the quiet hours, Emma realized a new phase of her hunt had begun. If she wanted the truth, It would have to be extracted, not simply discovered. The first move came one Monday morning while Richard was idly scanning the news on his tablet. Emma casually set her mug on the counter beside him and remarked, "It's strange the way security cameras sometimes go out at the worst moments, isn't it?" She kept her tone light, but made sure to hold his gaze a half-second too long. Richard looked up, his brow barely furrowing, a flicker of recognition, too quick for most to notice. "Happens all the time. Those things are cheap junk," he replied, offering her a neutral smile. But as she left the room, Emma felt his eyes trailing after her, measuring her words. From that morning forward, the tension inside their home was a living thing. An animal caged but prowling, snarling just below the surface. Richard began to adjust his own tactics. He monitored where Emma went in the house, often happening into the same rooms just after she'd entered. His laptop was never left unattended, and his phone was always locked, always in his pocket or his grip. Little adjustments, small but calculated. Emma welcomed them, seeing in his defensiveness a confirmation of her threat. For her part, Emma became an actress. With her aunt, with Daniel, with Richard himself, she downplayed her pain and her suspicions. She spoke of counseling, of getting back to her graduate studies, of maybe traveling for a while. A conversational smokescreen meant to lull him deeper into false security. She even deliberately abandoned her search for a day, watched from across the dining room as Richard's watchfulness slackened, his smiles tightening just a little less. But when she returned to her investigation, Emma doubled her caution and began setting her own traps. It started with small, psychological gambits. She left a file folder labeled Bank Statements, March-April, half visible on her desk one evening, knowing Richard would pass her room as he went to bed. The next morning, the folder had been subtly shifted. Inside, she'd placed only scanned copies of unimportant documents, but when she checked the original bank site later, she found an unsuccessful attempt at a password reset from a device she didn't recognize. She began dropping calculated remarks at dinner, sometimes to Daniel, sometimes to her aunt, never quite accusing, always ambiguous. "I wonder if Mom had any visitors the week before. Do you remember, Daniel? You know, strange things keep turning up missing in the online files. Maybe I should ask it at the bank for a security check. Somebody once told me that stress makes people act out of character. Isn't that true, Richard?" Every utterance was a stone thrown into still water, and Emma watched the ripples with alert, cold interest. Richard, for his part, was not idle. Soon after her first slip, Emma caught him rifling through the mail she'd left on the hall table. Papers she'd deliberately mixed with advertisements and her mother's old crossword puzzles. There was a new edge to his voice each evening, gruff and attentive, and Daniel began to ask Emma, "Why is he always annoyed with you? Why is everyone so jumpy?" Emma shrugged, but inside, she kept score. One afternoon, Emma returned from the library, the only place she could safely research without risk of family surveillance, to find the contents of her top desk drawer quietly disturbed. A delicate necklace her mother had given her was twisted around a thumb drive she had never shown anyone. She resisted the urge to recoil. Instead, she carefully straightened her things, then placed new bait in her drawer the next night. A half-written letter addressed to a lawyer, full of veiled references to a plan. The following day, the paper had moved. Richard was searching too. As the days ticked by, their duel became increasingly direct. Richard would corner her with sudden, invasive questions about where she spent her afternoons, whom she called, what she was working on so late at night. He began to plant doubts, confiding in Aunt Susan that he was worried about Emma's stress, suggesting, almost offhandedly, that maybe she should see someone. By the third such comment, Susan took Emma aside and gently urged her to let things rest, worry in her eyes. Emma nodded, feigning frailty, feigning a desire for calm. All the while, She stacked her evidence, documenting Richard's every odd movement, hoarding screen captures and call logs, transcribing the voice memo multiple times, and storing copies in the cloud and on drives hidden away. She created elaborate contingency plans with Olivia. If anything happened, Olivia would forward their findings to the police, the media, and a lawyer. Emma rehearsed her testimony, shoring up her own narrative, steeling herself for confrontation. Richard, too, escalated. One Thursday evening, as Emma was about to head out for groceries, he stopped her in the hallway, voice low and close. "You know, Emma, this family's been through enough. My patience is wearing thin." He held her gaze with an icy intensity that sent shivers through her. "You should think carefully about what you're doing." For a brief moment, the mask dropped, and Emma saw the calculating, desperate man beneath. Emma refused to blink first. "Thanks for the advice," she answered, injecting just a hint of defiance. "I always think carefully." By now, both participants in this silent war knew they were circling. Each waited for the next to slip. Richard became more unpredictable, sometimes leaving the house without explanation, sometimes brooding in his office for hours. Emma tracked the way he changed his routes, who he called, what he did, and she flagged even the smallest irregularity. But if he was capable of what she suspected, he was capable of lashing out, of cutting off her access, even of something worse. The mounting psychological pressure began to leave marks. Emma's sleep was light and fragmented, waking to every creak or groan of the old house. Her appetite dulled. Daniel, sensing the currents of anxiety, became even more withdrawn, and Susan's reassurances grew forced, her eyes darting between stepfather and stepdaughter. But Emma could not back down, and Richard could not relax. It was a dance of mutual paranoia, of calculated feints, and carefully masked intentions. In the end, Emma knew only one could emerge with the truth, and the other would be destroyed by it. As the week drew to a close, Emma looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her eyes shadowed but determined. She knew now. This was far more than simply finding clues. It was a battle of intellect and will. And she was in it, win or lose, until the very end. The darkness within the family. It happened gradually at first, but soon Emma felt the walls closing in around her. The house that once echoed with her mother's laughter and Daniel's jokes now rang hollow, its rooms shadowed by suspicion and whispered conversations she was not meant to hear. In their wake came something colder, more vicious than silence. Richard's growing manipulation, woven skillfully through the fragile bonds of their grieving family. Small inconveniences became daily hurdles. Emma's phone went missing for hours at a time, only to reappear on her pillow with its battery drained. Important emails inexplicably vanished from her inbox. One morning, she noticed her favorite mug shattered at the bottom of the trash. A spiteful message delivered with plausible deniability. She double-checked her encrypted files, quietly noting that some passwords no longer worked and a backup drive was missing from her drawer. There was no proof, but the intent was clear. Someone wanted her to feel watched, vulnerable, and alone. Richard's tactics became less subtle as her isolation deepened. He began to intercept calls from friends under the guise of protecting her privacy or helping her heal. When Olivia called, Richard answered, his tone polite but clipped, claiming Emma was resting and couldn't be disturbed. When Aunt Susan visited, Richard insisted Emma needed time alone to process her grief, adding slyly, "She's not herself these days. The stress is really getting to her. I worry sometimes about her state of mind." Susan's eyes flitted uneasily to Emma, her concern laced with new wariness. Emma soon found it difficult to step outside without Richard's permission. "Where are you going?" he'd ask, voice sugary with paternal concern. "It's not safe to be out so much when you're exhausted, Emma. Why don't you lie down?" He suggested therapy, offered to call someone himself, and when she objected, quietly threatened to intervene if she refused to help herself. The message beneath his kindness was unmistakable. If Emma didn't fall back into line, he would take matters further, and perhaps remove her from the picture altogether. Through all this, Daniel became even more withdrawn. With Emma cut off from her support system, Richard's words found fertile ground in her brother's bruised heart. He began parroting Richard's warnings whenever Emma tried to broach her suspicions, his expressions flickering between confusion, hurt, and outright fear. "You're scaring me, Em," he whispered one night after she tried to show him a cryptic bank statement. "I just want things to go back to normal. Please, just let it go." Late one evening, the storm inside the house reached a crescendo. Richard staged a family dinner, Aunt Susan at the table, Daniel sullen and silent, Richard presiding with forced patience. "Emma," he began, voice gentle but carrying across the room. "We're all worried. You've been unstable. You can't keep digging into things that aren't there, for your own sake and ours. We're going to get you some help. I've called Dr. Feldman. He'll see you in the morning. Maybe an inpatient stay, just until you're better." The implication was chilling. Comply or risk being declared mentally unfit. Panic clawed at Emma's chest as she saw the family closing ranks, their trust bending inexorably towards Richard's persuasive narrative. Aunt Susan, eyes shining with tears, whispered, "We just want you safe, sweetheart." Daniel refused to meet her gaze. The noose was tightening, and Emma knew if she lost her freedom now, every shred of evidence would vanish, and her mother's story would die in the dark. But desperation breeds ingenuity. That night, unable to sleep and fearful she was running out of time, Emma scoured every memory of her mother's routines for overlooked allies. Then she remembered. Mrs. Perkins, their longtime housekeeper, who had been quietly let go weeks before the accident, and whose sharp eyes missed nothing. Emma sent a coded message through a shared social media app, praying the woman still checked it. The reply was swift and cryptic. "Meet me at dawn, park bench by the bakery. Be careful." Before first light, Emma slipped from the house, leaving her worn sneakers by her bedroom window as a decoy. Every sense was wired, nerves jangling as she hurried into the pale hush of morning. Mrs. Perkins waited, face pale but resolute. She wasted no time. "I never believed the accident story," the old woman whispered, glancing around for watchers. "The night before she died, your mom called me, sounded terrified, begged me to come early the next morning. Said she had something for me to see, something important. Why would she fall down the stairs hours later? Why ask for help and then—" Mrs. Perkins's voice caught. "When I got there, Richard was already waiting at the door. He passed me an envelope to deliver, then said not to call the house anymore." With trembling hands, Mrs. Perkins handed Emma what she'd kept hidden all this time. A flash drive, scuffed and worn, labeled only with a strip of masking tape. "I didn't know what to do, but I kept it, just in case." Emma held back tears. It was the first true chink in Richard's armor, and perhaps her only hope. After returning home, Emma hid the flash drive in a hollowed-out book and began to examine its contents. What she found stunned her. A hidden audio recording of her mother arguing with Richard the night she died. His voice low and menacing, hers pleading, demanding answers about where the money went and who was calling after midnight. There were copies of emails, bank statements, even family photos annotated with terse, fearful notes. Most damning was a scanned letter, unsigned, warning, "If anything happens to me, ask Mrs. Perkins for the key." Consequences gathered like storm clouds. Richard's control at home tightened as he sensed her growing unease. At breakfast, he loomed behind her as she poured coffee, voice silky. "You seem distracted, Emma. Bad dreams again?" Daniel barely touched his cereal, eyes darting anxiously between them. Aunt Susan, now visiting more often, peppered Emma with gentle, leading questions about her fatigue and unusual stress. The family was ready to hand her over for professional help to erase her voice before it could be heard. But Emma, armed with the evidence from Mrs. Perkins, felt a dangerous resolve hardening inside her. Now she had more than suspicions and digital fragments. She had a living witness and tangible proof of Richard's deception. Each day, the lines in their domestic battlefield grew clearer. Richard, wounded but not yet defeated, retaliated with veiled threats and an iron grip on the house's routines. Emma, battered by loneliness and fear but burning with determination, sent her findings to trusted allies. Olivia, a lawyer her mother once worked with, and finally, a police sergeant whose name emerged in the old emails. She knew her time was running out. The darkness within the family, the web of denial, manipulation, and betrayal, was at its thickest. Yet at the center of the storm, Emma stood unbroken, ready to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. Victory or defeat would not just decide her mother's legacy. It would determine whether Emma herself would survive the darkness and step, at last, into the light. The truth reopened. The days that followed were a blur of silent maneuvering. Emma, exhausted but newly determined, moved through the house with careful purpose. Every moment felt perilous. Richard's suspicions had hardened into vigilance, and the family's nerves had frayed to near breaking point. Still, underneath the routine of her days, meals prepared in brittle silence, forced conversations with Aunt Susan, Daniel's averted eyes. Emma clung to the flash drive hidden deep inside her hollowed-out book. Her lifeline and her last hope. Her first step was to consolidate the evidence. With trembling hands, she copied every file from the drive. The audio recording of her mother's argument with Richard, financial documents marked up in her mother's hurried scrawl, emails and annotated photos, the unsigned warning letter. She indexed everything, matching dates, cross-referencing transactions, and compiling a timeline so clear and damning that even an outsider would see Richard's pattern of deceit. Then she encrypted the files twice over and sent password-protected copies to Olivia, her loyal friend, and to Ms. Quincy, her mother's old legal advisor, a woman both discreet and keenly intelligent. For good measure, Emma also included a note for Detective Owens, the police sergeant who'd quietly encouraged her questions in the weeks after the funeral. But Emma knew that evidence alone was not enough. Richard still held sway over Daniel and Aunt Susan, and his reputation in the community, his strength during the family tragedy, shielded him from many questions. The turning point would require a witness, someone whose testimony predated Emma's own doubts, someone who had seen or heard things she could not. Mrs. Perkins, the housekeeper, agreed to meet again, this time in the relative sanctuary of the lawyer's office. With Olivia and Miss Quincy present, Emma prompted Mrs. Perkins to repeat what she'd told her at dawn in the park. The urgent call from Emma's mother. The fearful request to come early. Her encounter with Richard on the doorstep. And finally, the envelope she'd been told to deliver. But there was more. Mrs. Perkins hesitated, then revealed that she'd overheard part of a phone call between Richard and a stranger just days before the accident. A call laced with code words and veiled threats. Her testimony, combined with the audio files, created a chain almost impossible to dispute. Meanwhile, Olivia worked quietly behind the scenes. She approached 3 former neighbors who had witnessed odd comings and goings at the house in the weeks before the fatal fall. 2 remembered seeing Richard deep in argument with a red-haired woman, likely Allison Walker, by his car in the driveway, well after dark. The third, a retired teacher, described a heated exchange between Emma's mother and Richard in an aisle of the hardware store the afternoon she bought the replacement light bulb. Details fell into place. Emma's mother had both feared and suspected her husband, and she'd tried, in her final days, to leave clues that would survive even her own silencing. Emma planned meticulously before acting. She drafted a detailed summary of the evidence, constructed a timeline, and attached corroborating witness statements. She rehearsed her own account, determined not to let Richard, or those invested in his innocence, swerve her with interruptions or accusations. Everything was ready except for the last step. Alerting the press. A move of last resort she would only trigger if the police proved unwilling to act on what she'd gathered. The tipping point came one stormy evening, soon after Emma finalized her report. She arrived home to find Richard pacing in the entry hall, phone clutched white-knuckled in his hand. He stopped abruptly as she entered, his face dark with suspicion. "You've been out a lot this week, Emma," he said, voice level but teeth gritted. "Making yourself busy? Or making trouble?" Emma answered steadily. "I've been talking with some people. Lawyers? The police?" She saw the shape of her own fear passing through his eyes. Saw, too, the flicker of desperation that all but confirmed his guilt. For hours that night, Emma waited in her room, adrenaline surging, fully expecting Richard to attempt something reckless. Around midnight, she heard soft footsteps and the click of her doorknob. She braced, heart hammering, as her door creaked open and Richard's silhouette filled the gap. He entered slowly, closing the door behind him, stepping forward as if he owned the room, and her. "You don't know what you're doing," he hissed. "You have no idea the damage you could cause with your lies." Emma straightened, refusing to shrink away. "They're not lies. I have proof. It's already with the police, a lawyer, and the press. You can't touch it. Or me." For a split second, pure rage flashed across Richard's face. Then it was gone, replaced by the mask of paternal concern he showed everyone else. This isn't healthy, Emma. You need help. Your mother wouldn't want... My mother wanted the truth. She tried to warn people. She kept records, and now everyone else will know too." Richard's facade finally cracked. He stepped closer, jaw clenched, voice a hoarse whisper. "You think they'll believe you? A grieving girl spinning wild stories? You're alone here, Emma." "I'm not alone," she replied, voice iron. "And the more you threaten me, the more they'll know what you are." A heavy silence filled the room before Richard retreated, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass. Emma's knees shook as she waited for the adrenaline to recede, her mind racing. She texted Olivia and Ms. Quincy the warning phrase they'd agreed on. "He confronted me. If you don't hear from me by morning, send everything." She sat on her bed in the dark, unable to sleep, rehearsing the sequence of what would likely come next. A visit from police, perhaps, or Richard's final gambit to destroy evidence or her reputation. She feared, rightly, that she was in real danger, but she'd reached the point where hiding was no longer possible. At dawn, the doorbell rang. 2 detectives and a uniformed officer stood outside. Olivia and Ms. Quincy were already arriving, and Mrs. Perkins had been called to repeat her statement at the station. Daniel, confused and groggy, watched as Richard was quietly led away for questioning, his attempts at composure melting into stony silence. In the hours that followed, Emma sat in the lawyer's office, surrounded by allies and documents. She gave her full statement, meticulously matching every file, memory, and witness to the evidence she had gathered. She watched, exhausted but steady, as her world tilted. The truth, long buried by gaslighting and fear, finally began to surface. And as the day unfolded, for the first time since her mother's death, Emma felt the faintest stirring of hope, an assurance, fragile and hard-won, that the darkness had not swallowed her whole. The decisive night. It was as though the storm had only intensified, both inside and outside the old house. Clouds mounted like walls in the darkening sky, their edges slashed by waves of rain. Emma's world was now a taut wire strung between hope and dread, vibrating with the electric sense that everything would change before morning. The authorities had begun to move, the interviews, the collection of evidence, but Emma knew that justice was never simple, never certain. So much still rested on her own ability to endure one final confrontation. That evening, Emma barely touched her dinner. Aunt Susan kept shooting worried glances her way. Daniel picked at his food, pale and silent. Richard's face was unreadable. Behind the bland mask, however, Emma recognized something frantic. An animal, cornered and dangerous. The conversation at the table was brittle, forced. Forks scraped. Thunder boomed outside, and the lights flickered as wind rattled the windows. Emma felt every sound like a blow to the chest. When Daniel left the table early, mumbling an excuse about homework, and Aunt Susan began clearing plates, Emma knew the moment was near. Richard lingered behind, watching her with cold calculation. "You've made things difficult for everyone, Emma," he murmured, voice barely more than a growl. "If you cared about this family, you wouldn't be dragging us through hell." Emma met his gaze. "If you cared, you wouldn't have destroyed us." Richard's mouth tightened. For a long moment, neither spoke, the air heavy with old pain and coming violence. As dusk thickened into night, Aunt Susan retreated to the guest room, and Daniel vanished behind the headphone bubble of music and games. The house was silent save for the storm outside and the low buzz of Emma's nerves. She checked her phone, fully charged, emergency contacts on speed dial, backup evidence uploaded to the cloud, and set to auto-send if she didn't check in by sunrise. Olivia was waiting for her call, and Miss Quincy had promised to keep watch. But Emma knew that, for the next few hours, she was alone. Shortly after midnight, a floorboard creaked behind her. She turned. Richard stood in the hall, his shape limned by lightning from the windows. "We need to talk," he said, voice tight. Emma steadied herself. "Then talk." He gestured for her to follow him. Against every screaming instinct, Emma did. She kept her phone pressed in her palm, the recording app already running. Every step down the corridor felt like crossing a battlefield. They stopped in the living room, the site of so many memories now tainted by doubts. Richard closed the heavy doors behind them, isolating the two of them in a world of shifting shadow and stormlight. "You can end this circus," he began, pacing between the coffee table and fireplace. "Withdraw what you said. Delete your files. Tell the police you were mistaken. I'll forgive you. We move on. Otherwise—" Emma cut him off. "You can threaten me, but you can't scare me anymore. I have everything I need, and so do others. You can't make the truth vanish." Richard's calm mask wavered. "Your truth, not reality. People believe what they're told, Emma. Are you sure you want to be remembered as the hysterical, vindictive stepdaughter?" "That's what you did to Mom, too, isn't it?" Her voice was steady, her fear boiled down to something like resolve. "You gaslit her until no one listened, and then you made sure she couldn't tell her story at all. But I will." Richard's hands balled into fists. "Enough! Give me the drives! Every copy, right now!" No, she said quietly. You only need to look at the police report to know they're not just with me anymore. Even if you found all my evidence, it's out there. You can't control what happens next. Lightning threw his face into sharp relief, eyes wild, desperate. You think you can beat me at this? You don't know what I've done to survive. One word from me about your instability, about your mother's mental health, and you'll spend the rest of your life trying to prove you're not insane. Just like her. Emma forced herself not to flinch. I'm not afraid of being doubted anymore. I'm not alone. I have witnesses. I have proof. You have nothing but lies. There was a pause, and then Richard lunged, coming fast and hard, not with the clumsy rage she expected, but with cold intent. He tried to grab her phone, but Emma sidestepped, adrenaline giving her a burst of clarity. She pressed record on her smartwatch, which had stayed half hidden beneath her sleeve, and held her ground. Stop it, Richard! The cameras work now. The police have been watching the house all night. One move against me, and you'll never leave this room without a uniform on your arm, she bluffed, voice ringing loud and certain through the darkness. For a split second, Richard hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the window as if searching for hidden faces in the storm. The bluff landed. He stepped back, breathing hard, chest rising and falling. The illusion of his authority, his ability to terrify, divide, and control, was crumbling before her. He realized it. What do you want? He spat. Justice, Emma wanted to say, but all she managed was the truth. Confess. Face what you've done. Let us go. Richard looked at her, searching for even a shred of mercy. He found none. For the first time, she saw the real man behind all the masks. A man cornered not by fate, but by the weight of everything he'd tried to bury. Outside, red and blue lights at last flashed across the windows. Police boots thundered up the porch. There was shouting, detectives calling Richard's name, and then the front door crashed open, the world rushing in with a flood of hope and terror. Richard made one last, desperate motion toward Emma, a silent plea, or perhaps a threat, she couldn't tell. But the police were too fast. In seconds, hands pulled him away, cuffs clattering behind his back, his voice lost in the noise of the house at last waking up. Daniel ran into the hallway, stunned, eyes wide. Aunt Susan wept openly, torn between fear and disbelief. Emma stood silent, blood pounding in her ears, phone still in her hand. The detectives gently questioned her, assuring her this ordeal was ending. Richard was led away into the storm, his last glance a venomous promise she could not decipher. The sun began to rise behind the clouds. The house was no longer silent, filled now with the professional shuffle of the police and hushed conversations. Emma could barely process the relief, the grief, or the guarded sense of victory. She held Daniel tight, let Aunt Susan apologize through her tears, and watched from the hallway as the door shut for the last time behind her mother's greatest tormentor. As mundane light filtered through rain-streaked glass, Emma realized with a hollow ache the decisive night was over. The truth, battered but alive, had survived the long storm. Now, at last, she could breathe. The fall of the villain. The aftermath of that storm-filled night was eerily quiet. Yet beneath the hush, something irrevocable had shifted. The villain was no longer lurking in the halls or watching from the corners of their lives. Richard was now the subject of headlines and hushed whispers throughout their broken community. The morning after his arrest, Emma sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the mug of coffee growing cold between her hands. The house was filled with a hollow sense of aftermath, as if the events that had threatened to shatter it for good had, in their violence, left it both emptier and somehow cleansed. Daniel had retreated to his room, processing in private. Aunt Susan shuffled through the rooms in a daze, forced for the first time to recognize that the narrative Emma fought for was, in fact, reality. News of Richard's arrest spread like wildfire. It began with urgent phone calls from family and neighbors, morphed into headlines on local news. Beloved family man arrested in wife's suspicious death. Suddenly, the facade Richard had maintained so flawlessly for years was stripped away, and the world glimpsed the calculating darkness he'd carefully hidden. The family's phone rang off the hook. Some calls offered sympathy. Most sought the lurid details. Detectives came and went, cataloging evidence, taking recorded statements, and carefully extracting every remaining trace of Richard's presence from the home. Emma supplied everything without emotion: digital records, hidden files, the flash drive, photos, timestamps, witness lists. She answered questions clearly, never once letting her voice waver. The trauma that would have left her raw or sobbing months earlier now seemed to have calcified into something unbreakable. She felt no tears for the loss of Richard, only a cold satisfaction at the unveiling of his true self. Richard's world unraveled even faster than anyone expected. His supporters, colleagues, golf buddies, neighbors quickly distanced themselves as the facts mounted. The financial fraud, the infidelity, the recorded threats, and most damning of all, the mounting forensic evidence that contradicted the original story of the tragic fall. His lawyer, quick to arrive, soon realized there was little to be done but negotiate the damage. By noon, the media had camped outside the family's gates. Emma's refusal to speak to reporters was interpreted as poise by some and suspicious silence by others, but she didn't care. She cared only for the truth, and for her mother. Aunt Susan struggled to reconcile her past loyalty to Richard with the present revelation. She cried often, shaking with the guilt of not believing Emma sooner. In one quiet moment, she clutched Emma's hands, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, honey. I should have listened. I should have seen what you saw." There were no easy words of forgiveness. Emma only nodded, her eyes cool and distant. Daniel emerged late in the afternoon, eyes rimmed red, confusion still etched on his face. "Did any of it matter, Em?" he whispered. "Pretending to be a family, acting like things were okay?" Emma wrapped her arms around him, more out of instinct than comfort. "It mattered to Mom, and it matters now that we know the truth. That's all we can hold on to." Over the following days, the official process of Richard's downfall continued with painful precision. Every hidden correspondence and transaction Emma had unearthed was corroborated by legal teams. Former friends came forward, with stories of Richard's mood swings, threats, offers of bribes to keep things quiet after the accident. The hardware store clerk confirmed the odd, urgent light bulb purchase. The neighbors admitted to seeing heated arguments and previously unfathomable late-night visits from a woman matching Allison Walker's description. Allison herself, cornered by detectives, confessed to her romantic involvement with Richard, though she tried to distance herself from the murder. The prosecution's case solidified. Emma testified at closed-door sessions, always cool, always precise. Even the detective on the case marveled privately to Emma about her composure. "Most people break down or lash out," he said. "You, though? You just keep standing?" She allowed herself the smallest of smiles, but said nothing. Family members who once doubted her now called with apologies, some sincere, some performative. For each voice that asked for forgiveness, Emma responded with polite brevity, never betraying the anger or sorrow hiding beneath her reserve. In her heart, she knew that wounds left by betrayal and isolation would never fully heal. But she had no energy to nurse old grief. Richard's trial date was set, and with it, the faint promise of closure. The days leading up to the trial were a blur of depositions, whispered strategy sessions with lawyers, and long nights haunted by memories. Emma found herself walking through the house at odd hours, retracing the steps her mother would have taken, standing by the top of the staircase and listening to the wind outside. Each echo in the house reminded her that justice, while powerful, could never return what had been stolen. The community, for so long insulated by Richard's charm, began to turn inward in shock and shame. Old friends left pies and careful notes at the doorstep, gestures of kindness that Emma accepted but never acknowledged. She had grown accustomed to her own company, to the cold clarity of survival. There was no room for pity or empty comfort now. When the trial opened, the courtroom was packed. Reporters jostled at the doors, eager for the sensational story of a family brought down from the inside. Emma took her place on the witness stand and told her story in measured, unwavering tones. She watched as Richard listened, pale and stone-faced, but the mask was gone for good. His guilt was in every tick, every shiver. There was no longer any way for him to charm or manipulate his way out. The verdict was inevitable. As the judge read the sentence, Emma noticed something strange. She felt no rush of triumph, no victory. Instead, a deep, almost icy satisfaction settled in her chest. The man who had tried so hard to silence her, and worse, dismiss her mother's life as a tragic accident, was finally exposed. His downfall was complete, his name now etched in memory not as a patriarch, but as a criminal. Afterward, the family gathered at home, numb and subdued. Emma sat by the window, watching the late light paint shadows across the lawn. Aunt Susan joined her, quietly weeping. Daniel, shaken but present, spoke little. No one celebrated. There was no joy in having been right, only relief that the worst was over, and perhaps in time, that new beginnings could take root where the darkness had finally lifted. That evening, as rain tapped gently on the glass, Emma stood and looked around the home she'd fought so hard to defend. Her mother was gone, and the villain was unmasked. But Emma's face was unreadable, cool, resolute, and distant. She felt neither grief nor happiness, only the quiet power of survival, and a resolve that the cycle of silence and denial would end with her. There would be no tears for Richard, only the promise that the truth had finally, irrevocably, come to light. Stepping out of the shadows. The weeks after the trial seemed to move in slow motion. The house that had been Emma's battleground for so long felt strange and silent, even in the return of summer. During the long, warm evenings, the world outside pushed forward with its usual rhythm. Yet every inch of the home still carried the scars of what had happened inside it. The air was heavy with memories that refused to fade, and Emma often found herself pausing on the stair landing, staring at nothing, hearing the echo of voices, her mother's laugh, Daniel's cheerful teasing, and sometimes, unbidden, Richard's hollow assurances about family. For a while, Emma stayed, partly out of loyalty to Daniel and Aunt Susan, and partly because she felt unmoored, freed from Richard's shadow, but not quite ready to imagine life beyond these walls. She spent quiet mornings cleaning out her mother's room, opening drawers slowly. Old perfume bottles, scarves, letters creased with age and affection. She wept in secret, curling up with faded photographs, letting herself feel not only the pain of loss, but also a strange, growing sense of peace. The truth was out. The dread she had carried for so long hung in the air, like a rain cloud finally burst. Daniel was silent at first, retreating into himself, sleeping late and barely eating. But over the days, Emma saw small changes. The way he paused before calling for her, how he left her notes by the kettle, tentative reminders that he needed her, needed this new version of their family, as broken and hopeful as it might be. Aunt Susan, too, was chastened, remorse flickering in every gesture as she tried to mend rifts. Her apologies arriving in halting, heartfelt words she'd never spoken while Richard was in power. The three of them began to cobble together a cautious routine: shared meals, slow walks in the garden, evenings spent watching old movies with the sound turned low, as if they were afraid to invite the world back in too soon. The outside world was harder to face. Neighbors waved quietly from a distance. Friends who had once gossiped at barbecues now left gifts and handwritten notes on the porch, apologies wrapped in ribbon or scrawled in careful penmanship. Emma read every letter but responded to almost none. She did not blame those who doubted her. She knew too well how easily denial could form a shield. But she had no energy left for resentment, nor the patience for anyone who wanted only to soothe their own consciences. Gradually, Emma began venturing out. She walked the same path her mother used to take, through the park, past the tiny bakery with its sun-bleached awning, under the old maples that had seen her family through years of ordinary days. She found herself in conversations with new people and old acquaintances, but always kept something of herself reserved, a cautiousness born of having fought too hard to give herself away too soon. As the summer deepened, Emma knew she could not stay in the house forever. The echoes there were too loud. Every wall, every window reminded her at once of what she had survived and what she had lost. One cloudy morning, she began packing her bags. She let Daniel help her, folding jeans and sweaters in silence, stowing away keepsakes: her mother's locket, a travel-worn paperback, the flash drive that had once held all of her hopes for justice and now felt strangely light. When she was done, Emma stood in her empty room, listening to the quiet. She realized that, for the first time, the silence didn't frighten her. The last farewell was neither dramatic nor tearful. She hugged Daniel tightly, whispered that he could call any time, promised Aunt Susan she would visit soon. There were tears, but they felt purifying, not heavy. "You're the bravest person I know," Aunt Susan said, her voice trembling. Daniel didn't speak, but clung to Emma until his knuckles were white. There was no grand speech, just the shared hope that piece by piece, they could rebuild. Emma's new life began with simple choices. She moved into a small apartment above a florist's shop at the edge of town, a place filled with sun and silence, her own to keep clean or cluttered as she wished. She painted the walls soft colors, filled the kitchen with the buttery smell of baking bread, and on lonely evenings, invited Olivia over for dinner, confiding in her when the weight of memory felt too much to bear alone. In those first months, Emma learned to navigate her freedom. There was the pleasure of locking her own door at night, the comfort of jogging headphones in, unafraid. She returned to her graduate studies, grateful for the routines of campus: lattes, lectures, friends who did not know her story unless she chose to share it. Slowly, Emma rediscovered the boundaries of trust. She let people in, but only as much as she wanted, no longer swayed by pressure or manipulation. Yet, for all her progress, Emma understood that wounds of the soul do not heal linearly. There were nights, a thunderstorm rattling her windows, or a phone ringing unexpectedly, when her skin prickled with remembered fear. There were moments she missed her mother so fiercely she could hardly breathe, and sometimes a flash of anger at Daniel or Aunt Susan would take her by surprise. But she held on to the certainty that survival was its own form of triumph. She did not expect to become whole overnight, nor to forgive every slight, but she had given herself permission, at last, to move forward. As autumn approached, Emma returned to the cemetery one gray morning. Carrying a single white lily, she knelt before her mother's grave, pressed her palm against the cool stone, and let the tears come in waves. "I did it, Mom. It's over. I love you." The words, spoken aloud to the wind, felt at once like a goodbye and a promise to remember. Standing, Emma watched as sunlight broke through gray clouds. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen. By the end of September, Emma had grown into her solitude, wearing it not as a wound, but as armor. She stayed in touch with Daniel and Aunt Susan, sometimes laughing, sometimes simply sitting in comfortable silence. She let herself say yes to new things: a solo train trip, a poetry reading, a late-night piano lesson at Olivia's urging. Each new experience felt like a brick laid in the foundation of a life she was now free to imagine for herself. The story would not close with perfect healing or easy forgiveness. Emma carried the memory of darkness, but she also carried light. The memory of her mother's strength, her own stubborn resolve, the knowledge that truth was worth every risk. Whether she would learn to forgive the family that doubted her was a question only time could answer. Yet, as she walked home beneath a sky swept clean by rain, Emma knew she had stepped out of the shadows, stronger for what she'd endured, braver for what she had faced, and content, at last, to claim her own beginning.